Welcome to the guided stitch. This tutorial is for a simple rice bag. Rice bags are awesome to make for yourself that you can warm up and use for sore muscles, or you can put it in the freezer for a homemade ice pack. They're also a simple gift, or I've even had students in my classroom sew a bunch of these that we've donated to local organizations that can use them for children or for older people. So this is a simple project where you'll get to apply lots of basic sewing techniques. Some things to know before you get started. For your fabric, you want to make sure you're using 100% cotton. You also want to use cotton thread in your sewing machine. Cotton fabrics are safe to use in the microwave because they are natural fibers. If you are using a polyester thread or fabric for other synthetic material, that is not safe to use in the microwave because they can melt or ignite when they are put under heat. So make sure your materials are 100% cotton. This is a flannel fabric, or a cotton quilting fabric will work. This is a great way to use up scraps. This is just a 10 by 10 square. You can also use different sizes and you'll just have a different size rice bag depending on what size of fabric you cut. So follow along as we see how to make this simple and fun rice bag. The first step is to fold your fabric right sides together. I'm using this night sky inspired fabric, so the darker side is the right side. I will fold it with the right sides touching and line up the long edge here and the short edges. You want to use just a couple pins or clips to hold it together. You don't need a lot. I would just pin probably one in each short end, and then I'll do two up here. With using one piece of fabric and then folding it to create the rice bag, I'll only need to sew the three sides, not where the fold is. However, I do need to make sure I leave an opening so I can turn this right side out when I'm done. So I recommend leaving a 2-inch opening. I'm just going to do that from the folded edge here, so that way I can do one continuous stitch. I'm using a friction pin to mark. These are fabric safe and they disappear with the iron. So this part from my mark to the folded edge, I will not sew. Next, I'm going to stitch this on the sewing machine. I'll use just a 1/4 inch seam allowance or a 1/2 inch. Again, this is a basic project. You can kind of do whatever feels good for you as far as the seam allowance you're comfortable with. And then I'll be sewing starting here and then down the long side and down the other short side, but stopping here at my mark to make sure I have an opening. Now I'm ready to stitch. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is just the edge of the presser foot on most standard sewing machines. I'll be starting here at this folded edge. I will make sure I back stitch where I start, and I'll pivot my corners as I sew my rice bag. Just a reminder of how to pivot corners. When I get close to the edge, I'll stop a 1/4 inch from the next side. I'll use the hand wheel or just make sure my needle stops in the down position so it's holding my place in the fabric. I can lift my presser foot, rotate my fabric, and then put my presser foot back down. I realized I pivoted a little too soon because I can see my fabric's not quite lined up with the presser foot. So all I have to do is pivot it back, take another stitch or so forward, line it up, and then I'm happier with that. I don't need to back stitch at the corner because I pivoted and I'm just continuing one stitch. I'll continue sewing this side, pivot the next corner, and then stop stitching at my opening. At the mark where I stopped sewing, I'll make sure that I backstitch to make that secure. Then I'm done stitching my seam. I'll make sure it all looks square and neat. My corners look nice and square with pivoting. Then I'm ready to move on to turning my rice bag right side out. The next step in making the rice bag is to trim your sewn corners. This reduces the bulk at the corners and makes the corners much more square when you turn it right side out. So you will go ahead and use your fabric shears, or you can use small thread scissors to just cut the fabric away at an angle. You don't want to cut your threads or your seam will have a hole in it and it will come apart. You also don't want to cut too close to it because then when you turn it right side out, again, you can accidentally make a hole. So leave at least an 1/8 inch at the corner. So just like that is how it should look before you turn it right side out. And then you'll repeat with the other 2 corners. Do not clip this one because that's where we'll be sewing it closed, and that'll just make it harder to line that up neatly when you stitch it. But you will cut the corners on this side and trim away that fabric. After trimming my corners at a diagonal, I will turn my rice bag right side out. A helpful tool once you get it turned is to use a point turner to push your corners out to make them nice and square. A point turner is just a plastic tool with this pointed end that helps you push the fabric out where your fingers can't quite reach. If you don't have a point turner, you can use the end of your shears. Just be careful because they might be pointed and push gently, but they can do the same thing. Or you could use like the end of a pencil to help get the fabric pushed all the way out. We don't want to have any fabric hiding in the seams when it's turned right side out. Now my rice bag is turned right side out. I will press this with the iron. It just helps make the seams more smooth and flat. Also, this part where my opening is, it will be helpful if I press that. The 1/4 inch edge of fabric should be tucked in, so it should naturally do that with having the seam here, but I want to make sure that's all tucked in and even. And if I press it now before I put the rice in, that will help that stay lined up correctly when I'm ready to sew the opening closed. Now I'm ready to press my rice bag. On the side where I have a seam, I just want to make sure my fabric is pushed all the way out. I sometimes just roll the seam a little bit in my fingers to make sure it's smooth and flat. Again, you don't want any fabric hiding in your seams. This is where my opening is, so I'll just make sure that the raw edges of the fabric are tucked in, and that's all looking even with this side. Then I'll press. Remember, pressing with your iron is an up and down motion. If you have a steam iron or a spray bottle, adding a little bit of moisture will help your cotton fabric just press nice and flat. Now I'm filling my bag with rice. I want a funnel to help me do this more easily, and also because it could end up a little messy with some stray rice, I'd recommend doing it over like a bowl. That's what I have, just a plastic bowl or some sort of bin or garbage can, just to help contain any mess so you don't have little grains of rice to clean up in your sewing space. So I'll just tuck the funnel into my opening, and then I will carefully pour in the rice. If you have a person to help you hold this while you dump the rice, that might make it even easier. Now, stop and check periodically so you don't overfill your rice bag. The amount of rice you put in there is your preference. Put a little less rice if you want it to be more flexible and moldable, or you can fill it with more rice if you want your rice bag to be more firm. You do need to make sure that you leave enough room you can sew the opening closed, so don't jam pack it full of rice or you won't be able to secure your opening. This leaves still quite a bit of space in mine. I could have put in a little more rice, or I like it being flexible so that it can be more moldable for those sore muscles or whatever applications you might use this in. Then my opening needs to be sewn shut, so I'm going to secure that so the rice doesn't fall out. In the meantime, you can pin it, or I like to use Wonder Clips, just a couple to hold it shut. Then we'll go to our machine to sew it closed. There are a few different options for closing your opening. You could hand sew it, watch for another guided stitch tutorial for how to do a invisible stitch for closing an opening, or you could just do a straight stitch. I'm choosing to do a zigzag stitch because that will make sure it catches all the layers and close my opening. I'm choosing to sew on the machine, even though it may not look as neat because you'll see the stitching line, but on the machine it's just really fast and easy to sew that opening closed. And where this might be something I'm making a lot of, or just a quick simple project that I want to use, and it's as much about the function of it as the appearance, then just having the zigzag stitch visible won't bother me. If you don't want to see the stitching and you want a more professional finish, then consider hand sewing your opening closed. So I'm just going to zigzag stitch right along my edge here to close up the opening. I don't need to sew the whole side, just where I left it open. Unless you want to sew the whole side to have that appearance, then you could. I chose a thread that blends with my fabric pretty well, so having that stitch visible doesn't bother me, and I make sure that I just close that entire opening and then trim off your loose threads. Now your rice bag is ready to use. When you put it in the microwave, start with just 30-second intervals so it doesn't overheat and risk burning you. Most microwaves will take 1 to 2 minutes, maybe a little more or less, to heat it, depending on the wattage and type of your microwave. But I recommend starting with just 30-second intervals. You can also put it in the freezer for a homemade ice pack. I hope you had fun making this and that now you have another project in your skill set that you can use to use up some of those fabric scraps or have a simple gift to make and give to someone. Thanks for following along, and keep sewing with the guided stitch.